On the morning of August 27, 1979, a 79-year-old man climbed aboard a small green fishing boat called Shadow 5 in the harbor at Mullimore on the Atlantic coast of County Sligo. For decades, he had returned to this stretch of water every summer, drawn by the cliffs, the cool weather, and the kind of privacy that money still bought in the Republic of Ireland. The boat itself was wooden, slow, and unremarkable. Its passenger held the titles of former Viceroy of India, former Chief of the Defense Staff, uncle of Prince Philip, mentor of the future King Charles, and one of the most photographed Englishmen of the 20th century. A few hours later, all of that lay scattered across the bay in pieces. The bomb killed him instantly, along with 3 other people on the boat. It closed an extraordinary public career that had taken in 2 world wars, the Partition of India, the modernization of the British Armed Forces, and the personal mentorship of the future King of England. The Provisional IRA planted the bomb the night before, around 50 pounds of explosive, attached to the underside of Shadow V, detonated by remote control from shore while the boat sat about a mile out from the harbor. The blast killed Lord Louis Mountbatten, his 14-year-old grandson Nicholas Knatchbull, a 15-year-old local crew boy, and the elderly mother-in-law of his daughter. By the same afternoon, the IRA released a statement calling the assassination an execution. By the next morning, every front page in Britain ran the news, and within days, half the British establishment had gathered for his funeral in Westminster Abbey. That counted as the official ending. The actual story runs a great deal stranger, and almost half a century later, the documents that explain it keep emerging. Before the title, the medals, and the gold-encrusted uniforms that became a Mountbatten trademark, he came into the world as Prince Louis of Battenberg. Born in 1900 at Frogmore House, on the Windsor estate, the infant Louis qualified as the great-grandson of Queen Victoria, the great-nephew of pretty much every monarch in Europe, and a fluent German speaker before he became a fluent English one. His full name at birth ran to several lines of titles, and his relatives included Tsars, Kaisers, and Kings. By the standards of European royalty in 1900, none of that registered as unusual. But by 1917, the German connection had turned into a problem. The First World War was grinding through its 3rd year, and Britain had lost an unspeakable number of men to German artillery. Public mood toward anything German shifted from suspicion into open hatred. People renamed their Dachshunds. The royal family, awkwardly enough, carried a German surname, and the king had spent most of his life surrounded by German relatives whose loyalties to Britain were now widely questioned in print. King George V solved this with a bureaucratic act of stagecraft. He ordered the family to drop their German titles and to repackage themselves as the House of Windsor. And the Battenbergs of England became the Mountbattens. Louis's father, once First Sea Lord of the Royal Navy until anti-German hysteria forced him out, received the consolation title of Marquess of Milford Haven. At 17, Louis emerged as Lord Louis Mountbatten, a teenage British aristocrat with a fresh surname and a complicated relationship with the country whose navy he had just joined. For the rest of his life, he would build his public identity around being more English than the English and more royal than the royals, while presenting himself as more senior than the records actually justified. Mountbatten entered the Royal Naval College at Osborne in 1913, then moved on to Dartmouth. By the time of the family rebranding, he stood in uniform. He served briefly at sea at the end of the war on the battleship Lion, 18 years old and watching his entire identity rewrite itself around him. After the war, Cambridge claimed him in the loosest possible sense of the word. He registered at Christ's College, attended classes when convenient, and turned up to a great many social engagements involving people whose surnames matched his own family tree. Cambridge became a place he passed through, not a place he completed. In 1922, he accompanied his cousin, the future Edward VIII, on a royal tour of India that ran 4 months. They shot tigers and attended durbars, hauled around the country on a special train, treated as semi-divine entities by a colonial administration that had not yet had its catastrophe. India, at this stage of his life, registered as a backdrop for photographs. That same year, he married Edwina Ashley. She came to him at 21, fabulously rich, the granddaughter of Sir Ernest Cassell, the financier who had once been a confidant of Edward VII. Edwina brought in roughly £2.3 million in inherited capital, which by 1922 standards translated into something close to several £100 million in modern money. Mountbatten brought charm and a famous surname. Edwina also carried charm plus restlessness plus what was, in actual fact, all the money. The couple moved into Brook House on Park Lane, which carried its own private lift between floors, and proceeded to spend the next decade as one of the most photographed pairs in Europe. The marriage, by every credible account, collapsed early. By the early 1930s, both partners had openly begun conducting affairs and tolerating each other's. An arrangement that Loney's 2019 biography documents through letters and diaries as something negotiated rather than discovered. By the standards of the time, the system registered as workable for an aristocratic couple. Divorce meant scandal. Open marriage with a closed mouth meant practicality. So this is where Mountbatten's adult life actually began, with the basic pillars of title, money, navy, and marriage all in place by his early 20s. The only piece still missing? A war. A war did eventually arrive. Through the 1920s and 1930s, Mountbatten built a career inside the Royal Navy that ran solid without being dazzling. He specialized in signals and communications, which sounds dry until you remember that signals officers ranked among the few people in the interwar Navy who actually understood radio, radar, and the emerging electronics of modern warfare. On this narrow technical front, his professionalism stood up. The work mattered to him. Mountbatten cultivated journalists. Scrapbooks of his own press coverage piled up at home, eventually running to dozens of volumes. He arranged his uniforms in front of mirrors and posed for photographs at angles he had personally selected. Other naval officers found this exhausting. Mountbatten, by contrast, was quietly building a reputation that would, in the absence of any combat record before 1939, do most of the heavy lifting for his eventual promotion. When the Second World War began, he held the rank of captain. Within months, he had command of the 5th Destroyer Flotilla, flying his flag on HMS Kelly, the operational job he had spent 20 years preparing for, and the one that would later put him at the center of the fiercest dispute about his command record. It would also nearly kill him. The Kelly led a short, expensive life. Under Mountbatten's command between 1939 and 1941, she suffered repeated damage, repeated repair, and finally destruction by German dive bombers off Crete in May 1941, with the loss of 130 men. Naval historians have argued for decades about how much of that record belongs to Mountbatten and how much to bad luck. Critics like Andrew Roberts, whose 1994 essay collection Eminent Churchillians did serious damage to the Mountbatten myth, argue that he lost ships at an unusual rate and authorized tactical decisions that produced avoidable casualties. Defenders counter that destroyer captains in the Mediterranean in 1941 were going to bleed no matter who held the bridge. Churchill, who carried a soft spot for the Mountbatten name from his old friendship with Mountbatten's father, appointed him Chief of Combined Operations later in 1941 and pushed him through to acting Vice Admiral over several hundred more senior officers. At 41, he jumped a generation of his colleagues. Royal patronage and Churchill's personal enthusiasm handled the rest. One of the operations he subsequently authorized was the Dieppe raid of August 19, 1942. The plan called for landing a force of mostly Canadian troops on the heavily defended French coast in daylight, with limited air support and almost no preliminary bombardment, so that the Allies could test how a major continental port might be seized. Of the 6,000 men who landed, more than 3,300 became casualties. Canadian regiments lost the equivalent of an entire division in a single morning. Mountbatten spent the rest of his life claiming that Dieppe, despite the casualties, had taught the Allies the operational lessons that made D-Day possible 2 years later. That represents the standard institutional defense, and it has faced dispute for decades. The Canadian historian Brian Loring Villa, in a 1989 book drawing on archival research the British government had tried to keep buried, argued that Mountbatten authorized the operation after it had been cancelled on his own initiative without proper authorization from the Chiefs of Staff. London has tended to spread the responsibility around. Canadian historiography has not been generous. Either way, Dieppe did not stop his rise. In 1943, he became Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia Command. He moved to Kandy in Ceylon, took over a palace, and oversaw the long, brutal campaign to push the Japanese out of Burma. The eventual reconquest counted as a serious military achievement, although most of the actual fighting fell to General William Slim and the men of the 14th Army, the so-called Forgotten Army that did the bleeding while Mountbatten did the public relations. By the end of the war, he had become Earl Mountbatten of Burma. The earldom referenced a campaign he had administered rather than fought. In February 1947, Clement Attlee asked Mountbatten to take the job of Viceroy of India. Britain was broke. The war had liquidated the empire's accounts, and India sat on the brink of communal civil war between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, with independence already promised and no real plan in place for how to deliver it. Attlee handed Mountbatten an assignment that was essentially impossible. Get out. Get out without looking like collapse. Decide along the way whether to leave behind a unified country or a partitioned one. Mountbatten arrived in March 1947. The original British timetable had set independence for June 1948, giving the administration roughly 15 months to work out the details, including the question of whether India would emerge as one country or two. Within 8 weeks of his arrival, he had unilaterally pushed the date forward to August 15, 1947. Why August 15? Because the date marked the 2nd anniversary of the Japanese surrender, a moment he personally found resonant. But why so suddenly? Because, he argued later, the situation was deteriorating so fast that any delay meant more violence. That claim has not held up well. The historians who have gone through the records since find the deteriorating situation defense unpersuasive at best, and on closer reading, the acceleration looks less like a humanitarian rescue and more like a personal preference attached to a personal date. The compressed timeline meant that the actual boundary between India and Pakistan was being drawn in real time by a London barrister named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never set foot in India before. Radcliffe received 5 weeks. From outdated census data and incomplete maps with no on-the-ground consultation, he produced the line that became the Radcliffe Line, cutting through provinces, villages, irrigation systems, rail networks, and family farms. The final boundary did not even appear in print until 2 days after independence, by which point millions of people were already moving and millions more were already preparing to kill each other. Mountbatten's defenders have argued for 70 years that without his acceleration, the violence would have run worse. The opposing position, advanced by historians like Alex von Tunzelmann and Andrew Lowney, holds that the acceleration caused the violence rather than solved it. The administrative machinery for a peaceful transfer of population, including the police, the railways, and the army units that would have been needed on the new border, was being dismantled before it could be repositioned. British troops who were supposed to keep order were already being shipped home, and Indian and Pakistani army units were themselves being partitioned. Nobody was in place. What came was the largest forced migration in human history up to that point. Around 14 million people were displaced, with Hindus and Sikhs fleeing what was now Pakistan for India, and Muslims fleeing India for Pakistan. The columns of refugees came under attack on roads, on trains, in fields, in villages, and trains arrived at stations with their passengers murdered. Women were abducted in 5-figure numbers. The death toll estimates have varied wildly across the decades. Early British accounts suggested 200,000, while modern academic estimates often settle around 1 million, and some Indian and Pakistani historians have argued for figures higher still. Mountbatten did not personally command these killings. The criticism does not rest on the claim that he ordered violence, but on the claim that he wrote a timetable that made it impossible to organize anything else, and that he refused to acknowledge as much even after the bodies had stacked up. He attended parties in Delhi while Punjab burned, attended ceremonies, gave interviews. He remained, relentlessly and performatively, optimistic about the transfer of power, even as the casualty figures climbed. Then he stayed. After August 15, the new Indian government asked him to remain on as the first Governor-General of independent India, which made him the first ex-viceroy in British imperial history to be invited back as a senior figure by the country he had just finished decolonizing. He accepted. So did Edwina, who became extraordinarily close to the new Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. The Nehru question is one of the most picked-over episodes in 20th century royal biography. What is verified, beyond serious dispute, is that Edwina and Nehru developed an emotional bond of unusual intensity, documented in hundreds of preserved letters that do not read as the correspondence of casual political acquaintances. They read intimate, anxious, dependent. The two wrote to each other about loneliness, about their separate burdens, about missing each other. Mountbatten himself knew about the relationship. He facilitated their time together and kept the correspondence in the family archive. In Lowney's account, he viewed the connection as politically convenient as well as personally tolerable. Whether the relationship ever turned sexual remains a point on which sources flatly disagree. Some historians and surviving family members maintain it did. Others insist it did not. Definitive proof was buried with the participants. What stands beyond dispute is that for the most consequential year of Indian decolonization, the British Viceroy's wife operated as the closest confidant of the Indian Prime Minister. Make of that what you will. The Mountbatten marriage rewards a closer look because it explains a great deal about how Louis operated in the rest of his life. Edwina was richer than him, often more politically perceptive than him, and by most contemporary accounts, harder to fool. She conducted her own affairs throughout the 1930s. He conducted his Lowney's archival work documents, both sets in considerable detail, and concludes that the open arrangement was negotiated rather than concealed, although the concealment from the wider public ran extensive. In private, the Mountbatten household ran famously chaotic and famously unequal. Edwina's money paid for everything. Louis's name carried everything in the press. Their daughters Patricia and Pamela grew up inside the arrangement and later wrote about it with some reserve. The marriage held together because both partners wanted access to the public roles it enabled, and divorce in the 1930s would have shattered the careers of both. Edwina died in 1960 in Borneo on a Red Cross inspection trip of a heart condition that had been worsening for years. She was 58. After her death, Louis kept her bedroom largely untouched and continued to defend the legacy of their joint humanitarian work in India for the rest of his life, even as his own private life carried on much as it had before. By all accounts, he came apart. He had also been thoroughly unfaithful to her for 30 years. Both of those things were true at once. What Mountbatten understood, better than almost any 20th century courtier, was that influence inside the British royal family had to be built across generations. Since no single lifespan gave you enough proximity to the throne to matter on its own, he held no throne. His sister Alice, however, had a son named Philip, who in 1947 married the future Queen Elizabeth II. Mountbatten engineered that match with extraordinary attention to detail. He mentored Philip for years, steering him toward the Royal Navy, introducing him to Elizabeth as early as 1939, when Philip was an 18-year-old cadet and Elizabeth a 13-year-old princess on a royal visit to Dartmouth. The mentorship covered Philip's career trajectory and his public manner. Behind closed doors, Mountbatten pushed the question of the new royal house's surname and insisted, loudly, that the children of Elizabeth and Philip should bear the name Mountbatten-Windsor. The surname battle, which drew in Churchill and the Queen Mother and lasted years, ended in a compromise that allowed the Mountbatten name to attach to royal descendants without becoming the official dynasty. That covered step one. Step two involved the next generation. When Charles, the heir to the throne, came of age in the 1960s and 1970s, Mountbatten installed himself as the boy's most active mentor outside Buckingham Palace. The correspondence between Mountbatten and Charles ran to hundreds of letters across more than a decade. Mountbatten coached him on women, on naval service, on royal duty, on which advisors to trust. Charles called him honorary grandfather. When Mountbatten died, Charles wrote in his diary that he felt as if part of his own life had been ripped out. Mountbatten had positioned himself over 5 decades as the indispensable senior male figure across 3 royal generations, outranking everyone in symbolic terms while being outranked by everyone in constitutional ones. The man held no real power, but his influence ran without limit. That posture took an entire adult life to build, and he tended it the way other men tend gardens. And every so often, the posture tempted him. The temptation came not from raw ambition, since by his 60s he had collected every honor available to a non-royal Englishman, but from something more peculiar to his particular kind of vanity. The conviction that the country, in a real emergency, would naturally turn to him. In May 1968, Britain found itself in one of its periodic economic and political nervous breakdowns. Harold Wilson's Labour government had devalued the pound the previous November. Strikes spread. The press turned hysterical. Inside a small circle of influential men in Fleet Street and the city, open talk circulated about replacing Wilson with a government of national salvation led, ideally, by a popular, non-political figure who could rally the country. Cecil King, the chairman of the International Publishing Corporation, which owned the Daily Mirror, arranged a meeting with Mountbatten at Mountbatten's home in May 1968. king brought along Sir Solly Zuckerman, the government's chief scientific advisor. He outlined the plan. A national crisis would arrive. Wilson would fall. Mountbatten, recently retired from the Ministry of Defense, would receive an invitation to head a transitional administration. Zuckerman, in his memoirs, recalled that Mountbatten allowed King to speak at some length before Zuckerman himself broke in to call the plan rank treachery and walked out, taking Mountbatten with him. King left disappointed. Mountbatten, in his own later account, claimed to have rejected the plan immediately. Other accounts, including those drawn from Mountbatten's own papers, suggest the rejection arrived less immediately than he later told it. He may have been tempted. Loney's biography sets out the case that he flirted with the idea long enough to alarm several of his advisors seriously, before, under their pressure, settling on a firm refusal. What can be said with certainty is this: a man with no constitutional standing was, for an afternoon in May 1968, listening to a serving newspaper magnate propose that he replace the elected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Whether he found this insulting or interesting depends on how generous you are willing to be. The British political establishment, once the story became public years later, decided collectively to file it under embarrassment best forgotten. It has not been forgotten. The 1968 meeting has remained ever since the broadcaster Robert Lacey first surfaced it in the 1970s. The single most damaging anecdote about Mountbatten's relationship with elected politics, and it has resisted every attempt by his defenders to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. Before the coup talk, between 1959 and 1965, Mountbatten held the post of Chief of the Defense Staff. That period of his career provides the material his defenders raise when other parts of his record come under attack, and on this narrow technocratic ground, they have a genuine case to make. When Mountbatten took the job, the British Armed Forces ran as a bureaucratic mess. The Royal Navy, the British Army, and the Royal Air Force each ran their own ministry, their own minister, their own civil service, their own procurement system, and their own ferocious tribal loyalty to their own way of doing things. The three services routinely undermined each other in front of the cabinet, duplicated procurement, sabotaged joint operations, and argued, sometimes literally in writing, about who should run a war. Mountbatten believed all three should be folded into a single Ministry of Defense under a single Defense Secretary, with a unified Chiefs of Staff Committee accountable to that Secretary. He pushed this reform for 6 years, overrode 3 sets of service chiefs, and outlasted 2 governments. By 1965, he had won. The unified Ministry of Defense existed, the 3 service ministries were gone, and the British defense apparatus had been redesigned along lines that would survive, essentially unchanged, for the next 40 years. That is not nothing. Most 20th century reformers of large bureaucracies are remembered for trying and failing. Mountbatten succeeded. He achieved it through a combination of stamina, personal charm, and a willingness to be hated by every senior officer who lost a fiefdom in the process. If his name had been Smith, this would be the part of his Wikipedia page that came first. That is not the part that comes first, and there are reasons. The defenders who lean on the Ministry of Defense reform are not wrong about the achievement, but they have been losing the argument for the past decade as a different kind of evidence has emerged. In 2019, while researching what became the Mountbattens, Their Lives and Loves, Andrew Lowney filed a Freedom of Information request with the United States National Archives. The request hit pay dirt. Among the documents he obtained sat a declassified 1944 FBI memorandum recording an interview with a British aristocrat named Baroness Decies, conducted as part of broader wartime intelligence work in the United States. The Baroness, speaking with an FBI officer, described Mountbatten in terms that ran neither flattering nor cautious. According to the memorandum, she stated that Mountbatten was, in the language of the document, a homosexual with a perversion for young boys. The memo went no further than that. It recorded the claim, filed it, and the file then sat in American intelligence storage for the next 75 years, untouched until Loney pulled it loose. The document does not represent the conclusion of an FBI investigation, only the record of an interview. One informant, repeating in 1944 what she described as common gossip in certain London social circles, made a claim that the FBI wrote down without testing. That counts as one woman's word, kept on paper. By itself, the 1944 file proves nothing. What it does provide is the first piece of contemporary written evidence that allegations against Mountbatten existed within his own lifetime, that they reached a foreign intelligence service, and that they sat known to people who would, in subsequent decades, have reasons to keep them quiet. A small piece of paper. It no longer stands alone, and the documents and legal filings that have joined it since 2019 have done a great deal to shift the question from whether the allegations exist to what they amount to. The Kincora Boys' Home took in at-risk boys in East Belfast from 1958 until 1980. In 1980, the Irish Independent broke the story that senior staff at the home had been systematically sexually abusing the residents, in some cases for decades. The subsequent investigations confirmed the abuse on a large scale. 3 staff members were convicted. A 1986 inquiry, led by Judge William Hughes, confirmed the institutional abuse and the failures of state authorities to act on warnings they had received over many years. What the Hughes inquiry did not investigate was the persistent allegation, raised by journalists and former residents from the 1980s onward, that the abuse at Kincora extended beyond the staff. That allegation went further. It held that prominent figures, including members of the British political and security establishment, were taken to Kincora to abuse boys, and that British intelligence services, in the form of MI5 and military intelligence, knew about this and used it for purposes of blackmail and political manipulation in Northern Ireland. For decades, these allegations circulated in Northern Irish political journalism without producing any successful prosecution. Most outlets dismissed the Kincora MI5 thesis as fringe. The exception was Chris Moore, whose 2024 book, Kincora, Britain's Shame, lays out the documentary case in detail, arguing that the British state actively obstructed serious investigation of Kincora because the abusers included figures the state wanted to protect. One of those figures, in Moore's account and in the testimony of multiple former residents, was Lord Louis Mountbatten. In October 2022, a man named Arthur Smith, who had been a resident at Kincora as a child in the late 1970s, waived his anonymity and filed a civil writ in the Northern Ireland High Court. The writ explicitly alleges that Mountbatten sexually abused Smith twice at Kincora when Smith was 11 years old. The case names the Department of Health and the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland among the defendants. As of 2026, the case remains ongoing. A civil writ does not equal a criminal conviction. Mountbatten can no longer defend himself or face prosecution. The Smith case alleges, it does not prove. What it does is push the allegations onto a formal legal record in the High Court of Northern Ireland, rather than leaving them as something whispered in newspapers and dismissed for decades as Irish Republican propaganda. Broader allegations placing Mountbatten in elite London exploitation networks during the 1970s circulate in adjacent journalism and in books like Lowney's. Those claims read looser, leaning largely on the testimony of former staff and intelligence sources who have spoken on background. The legal weight of formal proceedings has not yet arrived. Together with the Kincora case and the 1944 FBI file, however, they explain why Mountbatten's reputation in 2026 no longer counts as recoverable through the old method of waiting for the press to lose interest. By the late 1970s, Mountbatten had turned 79, retired from active service, and spent most summers at Classybon Castle, the family's estate on the Atlantic coast of Sligo. Warnings about the Irish security situation reached him for years. The British government assigned him minimal security, and he refused offers of additional protection. He believed, as he told several people, that the IRA would not target him. To his mind, he counted as the elderly uncle of the British royal family, a man who had not held active military command in well over a decade. The Provisional IRA held a different view. To them, Mountbatten embodied the British presence in Ireland made personal. A former colonial administrator, the architect of the most consequential partition in modern history, and, for several weeks every summer, an unprotected old man on a small boat off an undefended Irish coastline. A young IRA volunteer named Thomas McMahon attached the bomb to the underside of Shadow V on the night of August 26. The device weighed 50 pounds. The next morning, Mountbatten boarded the boat with his daughter Patricia, her husband John Brabourne, Brabourne's mother Doreen, and the twin grandchildren Nicholas and Timothy Knatchbull, aged 14. A 15-year-old local boy named Paul Maxwell had been hired as the boat's crew for the summer. They headed out around 11:30 inches the morning. A few minutes later, the bomb detonated by remote control from a cliff top and destroyed the boat in a single instant that scattered debris across the bay and pulled 3 people under immediately. Mountbatten died on the spot, along with his grandson Nicholas Knatchbull, and Paul Maxwell perished in the same explosion. Doreen Brabourne lasted only into the next day before her injuries took her. Patricia and Timothy survived with severe wounds and lived to write about it. 2 hours later, in a separate operation, the IRA killed 18 British soldiers in a roadside bombing at Warren Point in County Down, which became, taken together with the Mountbatten assassination earlier the same morning, the worst single day for the British Army in Northern Ireland during the entire Troubles. McMahon was arrested within hours and eventually convicted. He served 17 years. Released under the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, he walked free. The British state mourned Mountbatten with full ceremonial honors. His funeral at Westminster Abbey ran live on television, with 3,000 people in attendance, and the eulogy delivered by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Charles, the heir to the throne, looked visibly broken. The Queen, Mountbatten's niece-in-law for 32 years, attended with the rest of the senior royal family, including Prince Philip, whose own life Mountbatten had quietly engineered since 1939. That amounted to a state funeral for a man who had not held a state office in 14 years, with a scale of mourning that matched his social standing exactly. It also turned out to be his last successful piece of stagecraft. Walk through Westminster Abbey today, and his memorial still stands. The National Memorial Arboretum still carries the Mountbatten plaque. Royal Navy ship classes named after him remain in service. King Charles III, the grandson he raised, now sits on the throne, and he has not, in public, retracted any of the affection he expressed for the man he called honorary grandfather. The British establishment has not officially revisited the question of his standing. Books and archives have done the revisiting that the establishment has not. Loney's biography opened the case. Chris Moore's 2024 book pushed the institutional cover-up question into print, and Alex von Tunzelmann's reassessment of the end of empire reset the Indian record entirely. The Mountbatten of the official biography, the version Philip Ziegler wrote in 1985 with the family's full cooperation, has been quietly replaced in the working understanding of most current historians, by something darker and more complicated. That counts as the strange afterlife of a man who spent his entire career managing his own image. He managed it well. Even his death looked like a coronation, with the full apparatus of the British state turning out to mourn him in front of a live television audience. The archives, in the end, he could not manage. The boat called Shadow V carried its name, with the kind of unintentional irony that historians live for, in memory of a previous Mountbatten yacht that had also been destroyed. Mountbatten liked the name. The continuity appealed to him. He took comfort in the implication that he had survived everything. On August 27, 1979, the IRA proved that he had not. 47 years later, the documents are proving that some of what he survived in life has caught up with him in death. He spent 8 decades building a reputation. He cannot defend it now, and the people doing the unbuilding have neither his charm nor his archival head start, but they have the one resource he could never quite control, which is the slow accumulation of paper.